Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Martin, welcome back. For those who missed your last episode with us, can you introduce yourself again?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jessa. My name is Martin Lukacs. I'm a journalist, author, and the managing editor of The Breach, an independent outlet launched about 3 years ago now.
If any of you are listening and you don't know what he means by The Breach, then you haven't really been listening, because I was telling Martin before we started recording, our show heavily relies on their content and their investigative reports to beef up a lot of our stories, especially our rants, because they get us so angry reading your stuff. And, I was just extra triggered by your most recent article about the Ontario Attorney General's secret committee that you're going to tell us all about. And you quickly reminded us, though, that was intrinsically tied to another article that had us riled up a few months back that detailed Project Resolute, which is a project by the Ontario Police Service's hate crimes unit that targeted Palestinian solidarity activists. So what first put you on, Martin, to the fact that there may be a secret committee in the Ontario Attorney General's office?
Well, let me first say that, love providing fodder for rants. Definitely a submission of The Breach. How was I put onto this? Well, as you said, we've been reporting on the policing crackdown on Palestinian solidarity in Toronto, but also broadly across Canada. I think Toronto is probably where, because the Palestinian solidarity mobilization has been the strongest, the police reaction has also been the most severe and aggressive. And maybe I should take a step back and talk a little bit about the Project Resolute investigation, and then talk about this secretive committee within the Attorney General's office, which I think very much works hand in hand. So Project Resolute is a special operation by the Toronto Police in the aftermath of October 7th, which really handed over the investigation and policing of all Middle East protest to the hate crimes unit, which from that starting point was politically perverse, politically biased. The assumption that all Middle East protests, and namely solidarity protests with Palestinians in Gaza, somehow has an inherent connection to hate crimes, fundamentally tilted the orientation of the police. And we have seen over the past several months an incredible commitment of public resources, policing personnel drawn from all different units of the Toronto Police, focusing in on Palestinian solidarity, with a number of kind of egregious examples of overreach. Police have engaged in nighttime raids on activist homes, a tactic usually reserved for very violent criminal offenses.
Because you expect weapons to be a possibility, and so you want to surprise them.
Precisely.
Right? Or folks might be destroying evidence. But typically it's reserved for violent offenders.
Yeah, they call it the police terminology is guns and drugs. And they have snatched people off the street. They have engaged in trying to cultivate informants, especially among newer activists to the movement. They have used, trumped up bogus hate crime charges. I mean, that's been a key element of what the Toronto Police Project Resolute has done, which is to try to weaponize hate crime offenses to taint and undermine and impose more severe charges against people doing Palestinian solidarity work, because hate crime charges bring with them more severe consequences. having these operations be led by the hate crime unit has meant that there has been a natural outgrowth of their being the leaders of this policing operation.
The added charges of hate crime also bring with them the added public scrutiny and reinforcement of the damaging narrative that Palestinian solidarity is in itself a hate crime.
Precisely.
All right, we see politicians making that direct claim so explicitly.
So in probably the most prominent example of Project Resolute's operations was the Indigo 11 case, in which quite a banal act of mischief, namely politically postering Indigo to protest the CEO Heather Reisman's support and funding for the Israeli army, resulted in, these nighttime raids, incredible surveillance, interrogations, and then the police making a very big deal about how they were pursuing hate-motivated offenses, which netted them headlines in all the mainstream publications, from the Toronto Star all the way to the Toronto Sun on the Spectrum, amplifying this notion that what these activists had done was anti-Semitic, racist, a hate crime, which is, of course, an absurd allegation. One of the activists charged is Jewish herself. The Indigo protests were started by Jewish groups in part. So not only in terms of the consequences, but in terms of the public narrative that they have been able to tell, it has been incredibly damaging. And through reporting on Project Resolute, I started to learn from some of the lawyers who have been involved in defending some of these activists about the existence of a secretive, very shadowy committee within the Attorney General's ministry called the Hate Crime Working Group.
Okay, before we get the skinny on the secret committee, which sounds so nefarious, especially the way you frame it, I'm curious what your first reaction. Well, you know what? In all of this, anything is believable at this point. So, if folks were coming to me with stories of a secret committee, I would definitely have taken them seriously as well. But I do want to just add a little bit more about the Hate Crimes Unit and Project Resolute, if we may. It does shock me. You talked about their expanded mandate, because the Hate Crimes Unit has existed, obviously, before October 7th.
Yeah, since the mid 90s.
But a bulk of these changes came quite quickly, right? You're talking about the end of October and early November, where they explicitly added to their mandate to monitor or whatever the protests involving the Middle East, which is just a way to count. Like, they mean Palestine. The fact that they made any effort to use more inclusive language in something that's clearly so racist to begin with is kind of funny to me. You might as well have just said Palestine. Or you can't say Palestine, I guess.
Yeah, it's classic police bureaucraties.
Yeah, you'd have to acknowledge Palestine, so they're sitting there going, well, we can't say that, so let's just say the Middle East. Then next time they start hooting and hollering about another state, we've got this on paper, we're good. But they didn't just expand their mandate, right? The funding for them expanded so much, as well as their force. Like, you're talking about a 6-officer force expanded into 32?
Yeah, so there were six members expanded to 32, which is a 500% increase.
In November 2023.
Yes, November 2023. We saw this play out in the Indigo case where, we know from police sources that there were 8 officers working full-time on that case. They were canvassing in neighborhoods for webcam footage from people's homes. And the cops, this is probably cops doing overtime. I mean, this is a huge amount of resources. And then the police raids that night in late November involved 50 officers, a K-9 unit. I mean, that's like probably just for the raids alone an expenditure of $1 million.
I was going to say, were you able to quantify what Project Resolute has cost Toronto taxpayers?
The latest from police is that as of June, it's $16 million, but that does not include, and what should be included is the expense on the legal side in terms of then trying to prosecute these cases, which is probably a dozen more millions of dollars. So I would guess that the policing and legal costs are in the realm of $30 million. And we know that, there are at least a few better options for spending that money than harassing, targeting, criminalizing peaceful protest. Yeah, and what the report revealed was that these night raids hadn't just taken place in the Indigo case, which we all learned about through the arrests back in November, but there were other instances, including in the case of the Gardner Expressway protests. There was a group of activists who stopped traffic there for literally no more than 5 minutes. No one was harmed. Palestinian Canadian family in Mississauga had their home raided after 5 a.m. in January. Apparently, when I spoke to the family, the police started ringing and banging the door so hard that the dad and mom's bed on the second floor literally started shaking. And so this family that had come from Ramallah in 2005 and in fact had their homes raided, 20 years ago, were in absolute shock and horror. And I remember speaking to the individual's mom, and she was like, my first assumption was, has he killed someone? What has my son done? And, police kept the door open this was late January when the weather was frigid, while they sat the family down, while they searched the home. They basically turned his room and a few others upside down and, confiscated several of his possessions, carted out computers, cell phones, clothing. It was pretty incredible, though. The mom in particular, Suha, who I spoke to, reminded me about just incredible, resistance, resilience, and also just humor that Palestinians I have met in the West Bank have. I remember one of the things that the police said they were searching for was a black and white keffiyeh. And she was like, we're Palestinian. We have dozens of keffiyehs. Do you need us to help you with that? I also have Free Palestine posters. Do you want those too? Yeah. So, they kept their wits about them and their sense of humor despite the horror of the experience that they had to go through. Her son, who's an elementary school teacher, had his name broadcast in the media thanks to the cops. He teaches at a local school in Mississauga. People there found out about it. He had used to volunteer at the local YMCA. CTV News was broadcasting his arrest, and so incredibly damaging to the family's reputation. And interestingly, the Crown has now dropped those charges and has dropped many of the Indigo charges as well. So it really feels like on one level, the cops know that, the night raids and other aspects of the operation won't stand a chance when challenged on charter grounds. But they, I think, are hoping that they can get their moment in the media, get themselves these, slanted headlines, and that does, wreak the damage that they're hoping to affect. And then damn the prospects of actually getting these charges to stick. So in many ways, the media effect is what they are going for, which, just shows how cynical this whole enterprise from the police and certainly the government officials who are defending and supporting this is.
Yeah, and it's designed to demoralize as well the individuals and those who hear the stories and their comrades expecting. We talked to Anna Littman, and her worst fear was that some of these tactics that they were using would scare people into doing actions as simple as blocking the road for 5 minutes or taping a poster to a glass wall or window. When we're trying to get people to be able to escalate beyond some of these more passive actions, it's really hard to see the consequences play out like this. And I also imagine, it's not a point that I've picked up on before, but you mentioned it earlier, of the attempts to turn activists into informants. And I imagine putting them in these precarious situations helps them leverage those possibilities. Can you speak to what the attempts to recruit informants look like? because the audience here are mostly activists and organizers who are trying to strike that delicate balance of pulling in as many people as possible and trusting folks that want to do the work with keeping everybody safe and anticipating police infiltration.
Yeah, the one case I reported on in the piece was a newer activist to the movement named Cyrus Reynolds, who had been involved in some of the protests on the Avenue Road overpass. And he was one of the individuals who was arrested in the days after the Toronto police banned any protest on the overpass. And that was very much part of the project. It was claimed by Project Resolute as one of their claimed achievements. And he was arrested. And at the local police station, once he was released, he was approached by a detective who basically asked him to come to a side room within the police station and introduced himself as someone who works with the informant protection program, and basically made an offer to Cyrus that if he could, feed the cops intel, then, maybe he could lend him a hand, by implication, perhaps get those charges dropped for that service. And Cyrus is someone who, I think works in construction, and he's a tradesman. He'd never been an activist before, and Palestine, watching what was unfolding in Gaza, had spurred him to action for the first time in his life. And so it seemed to me that someone newer to the movement would be a natural target for the police to try to turn. And he was outraged by the suggestion and
thank you, Cyrus.
Point blank refused. The cop added a little bit of complicitous sexism. He was like, don't, at the very end, he was like, don't tell your wife about this. There's lots of things I don't tell my wife about either.
He clearly told someone.
And I think that kind of attempt to isolate someone is also a classic, police tactic. Cyrus's charges also were ultimately dropped because there's absolutely no charter grounds for arresting someone for peaceful protests on an overpass sidewalk. So cops will always be trying to infiltrate our movements and develop informants. And I think if we maintain openness, transparency, even as we escalate towards civil disobedience and nonviolent direct action, that is always the best way to operate in the face of any kinds of police efforts to infiltrate our movements. We just have to assume that that's always the case. And I think it can't allow us not to have faith in people's good intentions and entry into our movements, because then it just insinuates all kind of paranoia and really damages our ability to have faith in each other, which is really the only thing we have up against money and power. Just to speak to your earlier point, Kevin Walby, who's a really super smart criminal justice professor who studies policing, had a great phrase that I hadn't heard before, which was strategic incapacitation. And it's a kind of academic term, but it comes from the literature studying policing. And it emerges in the post-Occupy moment to try to explain the role of police in that moment, but certainly in many other moments. And I think that's a really good explanation for what the police and government intentions are with this kind of crackdown. That yes, precisely, bogus charges, these kinds of very chilling and dramatic and aggressive arrests are intended to try to undermine people's motivation to become involved in movements, especially new people. But I think ultimately it hasn't worked, which is what's so great.
I think you're right on that, but what it does do is it definitely drains a lot of resources.
Definitely.
Right? Even if folks are still as motivated, and some of them are even saying like, fuck my bail conditions, like literally have not slowed down at all. But, we're having to contribute a lot to community defense funds, yes, and lawyers having to donate their time constantly to keep this rotation of activists, get them out, get their bail conditions cleared, try to get some of these charges dropped. So how maddening to find out that the cops are getting pre and post charge consultations and advice from the secret committee that we had hinted at.
Yeah. So at long last, we'll get to the. I've been calling it a secretive committee because it's not entirely secret in the sense that the people who know about it are, I heard about this from some lawyers who told me, to their surprise, these are defense lawyers, to their surprise, as they were trying to negotiate withdrawals for some of the most like spurious and bogus charges with Crown prosecutors, they were finding out that there was this committee within the Attorney General's ministry that was intervening in an effort to prevent the withdrawal of these charges, to encourage more severe charges from being applied. And so I started to look into this committee, and I say secretive in the sense that there is like a cookie crumb trail out there, because this advisory committee, which is made up of about 24 Crown prosecutors, some most active, some resigned or retired, excuse me, basically serve officially to advise police before they lay charges in any hate-related investigations. And the cookie crumb trail I found because often they give presentations to police conferences, and those are the few times where their membership in this hate crime working group is indicated. But once I had a sense of this from lawyers, I started trying to contact the Ministry of the Attorney General. And it was funny. This happens sometimes. You get an immediate response from, in this case, the communications person who said, "Oh, well, yeah, received. We'll look into this for you and get back to you." And then radio silence. And then I left phone messages and followed up with emails over several months, and zero. And so I started calling the Crown prosecutors themselves, who I had an inkling that they might be part of this group, and they would freak out when I got them on the phone and be like, "I can't talk to you. Like, call the media spokespeople." And I said, "I've already done that. Can you just confirm for me whether you are part of this group or not, and what is the basic mandate?" And they were like, "I can't do that." And then I really lucked out. I had started piecing together the story as best I could, and then it turned out that one of the assistant deputy ministers had written a memo to police service boards across the country about the hate crime working group. And the Windsor Police Board, thank you so much, seems like accidentally just posted it.
That's the first time ever we've thanked a police board on
yes,
last.
Posted it on their website as part of a cache of documents.
Oopsies.
And that had the full list finally of all the members, and it had an outlining of the responsibilities of this hate crime working group.
When did they do this?
So it was formed in 2019.
Yeah, but when did you get that release?
Oh, that was a few weeks ago. So
You must have been so giddy.
I was so happy.
I can imagine, Martin.
And I was like, yeah, sometimes you catch these lucky breaks.
From cops.
Wow. Well, for the police service board, so who knows? Maybe they're local city councilors. So that confirmed the people who were in the group, and we were doing research about the people involved, and it was interesting to discover that some of them had very clearly articulated views about Israel and Palestine. Notable biases. One person in particular, or there's two. One, the chair has described herself of this advisory committee has described herself as being committed and loving the state of Israel. Another one, through some open source research I discovered, has signed CJA petitions, has given presentations about using the law to very pro-Israeli legal groups that are trying to, very aggressively defend what Israel is doing in Gaza.
I want to give the title for that because I feel like it could be the title of this episode even. Like, what did she call it? Leveraging criminal law for critical action. That's the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
Like, critical action's kind of couched. It's kind of vague, but like...
Yeah, leveraging... It's a great point. Leveraging law, instrumentalizing the law. The law is not, in the liberal imagination, not supposed to be leverage. It's just supposed to be accorded to, adhered to, not leveraged and instrumentalized or weaponized. So that was, quite fascinating. She also let loose on her LinkedIn post a few times and called a Canadian pro-Palestinian activist a terrorist. The individual in question is actually has noxious views. They've said anti-Semitic things and they've been condemned by many Palestinian solidarity groups, but
persona non grata at most actions.
Yes, but definitely has not been charged with any terrorism-related offenses. So it was very revealing of the biases and outlook of one of these people who is supposed to be advising the police on what is and isn't a hate crime. And
now, was that an active Crown prosecutor?
She retired about a year ago. And so this committee, far from merely providing advice about what charges should be laid, was actually taking quite an active interventionist role in trying to shape how police operate, not just giving them backing, but encouraging a more aggressive crackdown on activists. In investigating them, I also learned about a previous instance when they had been involved well before October 7th. This dates back to 2021, when a Hamilton-based rabbi and activist with the IJV, David Mivasar, had been arrested and charged for having just splashed some soluble red paint on the steps of the Israeli consulate in protest of, at that time, Israel bombing Gaza and killing, I think, 260 people, flattening several residential buildings. And he had been charged with mischief. I spoke to the lawyer who defended him, and he recalls how, in cases like this, it's barely a criminal charge, what he did. In these kind of situations, it's almost automatic that the Crown will accept community service or just withdraw the charges.
Or sometimes pay for the cost of repair.
Exactly, or a donation to some kind of community charity. But in this case, the lawyer was stunned when what actually happened was two very high-profile, high-ranking Crown prosecutors were deployed to work on the case. Both of them members of the hate crime working group.
Deployed. That sounds ominous.
And one of them was the person in question I was telling you about, who has, talked about leveraging the law with pro-Israeli groups.
Rochelle Darenfeld.
That's right. And they, similarly, as in all these other cases we've seen recently, were pushing for more severe charges, were dragged out the case for months and months and months. There was one other fascinating revelation that emerged from this, which I think tells you a lot about the kind of political outlook and connections of this group, which was, in these situations, often police will, get a victim statement from the victims. In this case, quote unquote victims, the Israeli consulate staff.
Those stairs.
And yes, the stairs, soluble paint, washed off probably within an hour. By a rabbi of all people, a real menace to Jewish people.
Well, you have met David. No. Yeah.
So what was striking is, and this came out through the court proceedings, that the police hadn't actually been able to get through to the Israeli consulate staff. But who had been able to get through to the consulate staff and was able to provide a statement from them was these Crown prosecutors, these members of the hate crime working group. So they had greater access to the Israeli consulate, representatives of the Israeli government, than the police themselves, which to my mind, shows that the kind of evident interlocks that exist between essentially government officials, Crown prosecutors in this case, and the Israeli interests within the Canadian state. Yeah, and I think that is a larger takeaway from this story to me, which is that I think this moment of an unfolding genocide in Gaza and an incredible upsurge of mobilization, solidarity mobilizations in the West, has, I think, laid bare a lot of the latent pro-Israeli biases that exist in a lot of our institutions. And they've had to in order to defend the indefensible, a lot of these networks and interests within institutions like in this case, the Attorney General's ministry, have had to be activated in a way where we have become aware of their operations in a way that we were not before.
I was going to say they're not latent anymore.
That's the silver lining of all this, that we're becoming far more conscious of these entrenched interests. And now the next task is to, unveil them and shine a spotlight and start to campaign against their ability to wreak the kind of damage they're trying to wreak.
Yeah, I just want to, I can see people, because I'm feeling it, when you hear just how brazen it's become, right? How open, and, when Martin talks about them being activated, and it was such gall, that as though that might be an assertive thing, a positive thing on their behalf, right? That they just do this kind of out in the open more so, or, it's been forced out in the open, but there's been space made for it. But at the same time, the reason it was always sort of hidden is because it's so illegitimate. And any kind of oppressive system like that, the biggest hurdle is taking the mask off, because once fully exposed, as we are seeing now, even with the concept of Zionism being fully understood and the consequences of it, it's quickly becoming understood and then railed against, right? Because once you fully understand something that oppressive or corrupt, in the case of the police relations with this lobby group, it can't hold forever. It can't hold out in the open like that forever.
I do think the brazenness, for instance, of this advisory committee, and certainly of lobby groups like CJA and others, is a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of strength. I think they are, in trying to defend the indefensible, are finding themselves having to make ever more contorted arguments, ever more baseless allegations, or, in the case of this advisory committee, put their finger on the scale in a way they haven't had to in the past, in order to do as much as possible to do apologetics for the Israeli state. And so I think that, it is positive. Of course, the consequences are positive, but it's positive that we now can see it.
It doesn't always feel that way, though. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, how can they be getting away with this? Like, how can you be so bold?
There's a reason that the ministry didn't get back to us, and there's operating in the shadows means that they can operate unaccountably. My hope was that in reporting the contours of this group's operations, it would mean that outlets like this Toronto Star maybe would follow up, and the government wouldn't be able not to return their phone calls in the way that they don't return the phone calls of a small independent media outlet. That hasn't happened, and that probably speaks to the biases operative in places like the Toronto Star. But at least we have lit the first match, and hopefully now others eventually can start to ask questions. Maybe it will take politicians also demanding some answers about the operation of this group, which is really about the politicization of the law, this overt leveraging of the law to silence, smear, delegitimize, and undermine the struggle for Palestinian rights. But now that it's more in the open, we can call it out in a way we couldn't before.
The danger is, though, if it becomes normalized, despite its exposure, then we can only count on this to repeat itself over and over again with every other movement that challenges the status quo. Because although you've done an excellent job of demonstrating the ties between Zionists and supporters, the Israeli lobby, to the actions of the Toronto Police and the secretive committee, Attorney General's office, we know that its application will extend beyond that, but also that's what's giving a lot of folks in powerful places who perhaps could care less about Israel one way or the other, capitalists just in it for capital. This is such a immense tool to be able to increase police powers, and just the disregard for the consequences of law. It means, like, how many times can you charge people and have them dropped where there's no consequences? Because I imagine there's some of these activists, I hope, that are launching legal battles, perhaps, against wrongful arrest, wrongful prosecution, because some of them are just so blatantly obvious, especially when I think of the case of Sky Johnson, where all of these charges were thrown at her for literally putting up like a couple sheets of paper with scotch tape on a Starbucks, and or the examples you gave of.
Oh, I'm not familiar with this case.
Yeah, that's in the Avenue Road area as well. It kind of what started police attention in that area, because they started to mobilize around this one particular activist that was just like picked on and made an example of. So now if you Google her name, we had her on the show, but if you Google her name, unfortunately, it's just all these headlines about being a terrorist supporter and being accused of a hate crime. And, you know, when you get her story, the bail conditions imposed on her for taping up paper. And this was very, very early on in the growth of the Palestinian solidarity movement. Like, not that I hate saying, you know, using October 7th always as a measure, but we're kind of forced to sometimes. But yeah, it's incredible, the stories that we probably don't even know about. Like, if I'm telling you about Sky Johnson, how many other stories that, you know, they just didn't want to tell them, or they turned informant, you know, or, you know, it's just too much for them and they've stepped away from the movement now forever because it's just too much. Mm-hmm. Like, some of these consequences, even if your charges are dropped, like, their lives have been turned upside down. So we clearly have to get more exposure on this particular committee here in Ontario. Have there been groups that are picking up on mobilizing around it that folks can? Not
as far as I know. I do, you know, as you know very well, there is a lot of legal support work happening, and it seems to me, defending some of these individuals falsely accused of hate motivated crimes seems to be the priority. It's hard to wrap your head around, you know. I don't know if it's necessarily a thing that can be mobilized well around, you know.
You mean it's like hard to put your finger on like one demand or one individual to resign or anything like that? Like, how do it's systemic?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's part of it as well, you know. Like, are we calling for them to democratize the hate crime working group? You know, no, probably not. It would probably be better without the entity at all.
I want to interject here because I have an important point in my note that I didn't get to, and okay. That is, for folks out there, need to understand the support that things like hate crime units have. And hate crimes are awful. Okay, I'm not sitting here saying like we just need to let that exist in our society, but obviously you might already know that I come from an abolitionist point of view to begin with, but the NDP, in not even just in its policy book or in its convention, but in their platform for the last election, they had promises to increase funding for hate crime units. And you rightfully point out in your original article about Project Resolute that Mayor Olivia Chow fully supported this focus on safety and policing in response to what was happening in Palestine. And the police board has done nothing but facilitate all of this. So if you're looking to mobilize around it in any way, it could be at least to demand that your leftist parties don't feed into the solution of hate crime units as a means to make our communities safer. And I think this goes beyond defunding the police, but the NDP would never say they're pro-police, but they do advocate for using these kinds of tools and to increase their funding to the levels that we're seeing now that are then being utilized against our own movements. So
yes,
the normalization of that is got to stop.
Yeah, and I agree. And I do think that the weaponization of the hate crimes framework also raises some important like deeper philosophical and political questions about problems inherent to the hate crimes framework to start with. So, I mean, the hate crime framework individualizes the nature of reactionary violence. It makes these things out to be that the culprit of such reactionary violence is not reactionary ideologies, reactionary forces, reactionary political parties. It's sole individuals, and it also lends itself to policing solutions, and ultimately hate that is an outgrowth of white supremacy, racism, all the normal operations of capitalism are not best attacked as hate crimes, but as those ideologies that we should be naming and fighting politically. So police aren't going to be the solution to hate crime. So I didn't realize that the NDP had included that in their platform. So that's a good one for those working to shift those kinds of policies. That would be an important one. And I think now over the last few months, we've seen in probably the most brazen and clear-cut ways how the hate crime framework is so easily weaponizable against a marginalized, subjugated population like Palestinians and their allies. I mean, I think as one person I spoke to, I didn't put this in the piece, but it's like, because it felt so obvious, but also beyond the bounds of the piece philosophically. I mean, if the police were genuinely interested in pursuing hate crimes, then they would be, laying siege to the government consulates and government institutions, including Canada's, including the U.S. Embassy, including the
Rebel News truck,
Israeli consulate on this issue, And obviously, like, that's not the world we live in. That's not the function of police. But if we take hate crimes at their face value, then that's what it would mean. But obviously, we live in the real world where police are servants and
of capital
of their capitalist masters. So that's not how things roll out.
We kind of did the same with the Emergencies Act too. I feel there was support for it because of the horribleness that became the Ottawa convoy, right?
Support on some sides. I think it was mistaken.
Yeah, there were some proponents, but generally the NDP and some folks who just saw no other solution, right? Community-based solution to the problem, looked to police as that solution. And we often step into, when I say we, I don't mean me and Martin.
Yes.
I mean we collectively as the left, and I know we're not a homogenous group either, but it exists, that current of not sometimes recognizing these mechanisms because in the moment they may benefit us or at least curtail our perceived opponents.
Yes.
And so we muddy those waters, or we normalize things that really we should be challenging, but they're just so difficult. Like, it's really hard to have that hate crimes unit shouldn't really be a thing conversation when folks are experiencing hate crimes, like especially when you talk to, Muslim people will tell you every day of their lives here, visibly Muslim people experience what you could call hate crimes all the time. And there's got to be a solution to that. So it's like such a deep conversation that people aren't making time for. So the easy answer is, okay, we won't fund police, but we will fund these hate crime units because that's really bad.
Yeah.
That's something we can't just pretend doesn't happen.
No, and Jewish communities are subject to hate crimes as well. Yeah, I think we have to think hard about how our safety is not to be found in the police. And I mean, the same principle extends to discussion about terrorist labels as well. There are currents in the left who want, for instance, like organizations like the JDL to be labeled as terrorists in the same way that Palestinian organizations have been labeled as terrorist entities. But this is a inherently reactionary framework that will only shore up the ability of the government to use it against marginalized communities, left-wing organizations. And so it's a real mistake, I think, to play into that. And the NDP certainly does that on that front as well. We've seen this happening on the foreign interference debate as well. And it's playing out now, I think, in the hate crime debate as well. To the extent that there is a debate, I don't think it's like a particularly live debate yet, but it should happen. I think it's going to take more journalism, including from the mainstream outlets, to elevate it to an issue of public debate.
Yeah, like pressing public debate. I wonder, through all of the interviews that you've done on this and all the research, whether you could offer any advice to organizers and activists who are in this environment now. Like maybe they haven't experienced it, that heavy hand just yet, but especially from maybe your discussions with lawyers and what has been working for them in terms of getting charges dropped or pushing back against this influence that's coming from the Attorney General's office.
I mean, I would just say keep doing what you're doing. And as someone who's been on and off involved in Palestinian solidarity for 20 years now, it has been incredible to witness the flourishing of this movement, the entry of people who have never been active before in any kind of political organizing. And it seems clear to me that the attempts to chill the movement haven't worked. Yes, it's true, as you mentioned earlier, that many of the day-to-day organizers are now wrapped up in doing legal solidarity and fundraising. I mean, that to some degree is inevitable, I think, in our work. But it has been moving to me that in its latest incarnation, the student encampments, people's appetite and courage has grown by leaps and bounds rather than diminishing in the face of police threats, police brutality, and the long arm of the law. Yeah, I think I'm inspired, and I think the fact that the charges are being dropped is a very good sign that the police overreached, probably in a way that they understood, and that we're all on the right path. And the more we can broaden the movement, bring newcomers in, the stronger we'll be in fighting this really pitched battle right now over defining the terms of the debate that I think will play out now in the coming years. Where I think our hand, the hand of those committed to Palestinian liberation and dignity for all who live in the Middle East, has been strengthened, despite the brazen and aggressive and much better funded efforts of our opponents. So I'm quite heartened about where we're at, despite obviously the horrendous toll that unfold in Gaza. I think for those of us who have a long-term view, which we have to, unfortunately, because these struggles for decolonization take decades and generations, I think I'm very hopeful, despite everything, about where the movement is at right now. And I think the work that everyone is doing and the sacrifices people are making will pay off. They will.
Thank you, Martin. Again, I very much appreciate your role and your team's role at The Breach in giving us ammunition in our fight. Quite often we sense that these things are happening. They feel unfair. It feels heavy-handed. It's corrupt, especially some of the charges we've talked about, like unlawful assembly while masked as added charges. And you could see that it was coordinated, but thanks to your work, we know it is, and we know what its end purpose is. We know where it's coming from. We've got some names, and that's a fucking start to eat away at that part. And it's also a flag to other urban centers that are likely going to be experiencing this kind of interference as well, right? Perhaps, you undercovered something in Ontario, but I can't imagine that this is not replicated elsewhere to some level. So, exposing it here starts that process. And I imagine it's very validating for some of the people who have been through it, maybe even saw it, but couldn't get anybody to listen to them, to kind of uncover it all and show it to them and be like, you're not imagining this. This is happening. This is a lot more coming down on you than you deserved. Yeah, that's important for our movement, that there's journalists out there doing that work to essentially protect the activists in the long run. so that we can do what we got to do. So thank you, Martin, also for taking the time and coming on Blueprints. We very much appreciate it.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.